A woman can survive a loveless marriage. Evelyn's mother had once whispered while fastening the pearls around her daughter's throat. But surviving a man who looks through you as though you do not exist, that is a colder kind of death. The memory returned to Evelyn Whitmore the moment the carriage rolled beneath the iron gates of Blackthorne Hall. Rain struck the windows in silver streams while thunder echoed across the dark hills surrounding the estate. Somewhere beyond the storm stood the man she had married only 3 hours earlier, Duke Lucian Ravensheir, one of the wealthiest men in England. A widower feared for his silence more than his temper. The carriage finally stopped before the massive stone manor, its tall windows glowing faintly through the rain like watchful eyes. A servant hurried forward with an umbrella, but the cold had already soaked through Evelyn's gloves as she stepped onto the slick gravel. The front doors opened slowly. Warm candlelight spilled across the marble entrance hall, illuminating towering staircases, black polished floors, and portraits of long-dead Ravensheir's staring down from shadowed walls. Yet despite the grandeur surrounding her, the house felt strangely empty. Hollow, like a cathedral abandoned by God. Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravensheir, the butler announced formally. The words echoed through the enormous hall. No answer came. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the folds of her traveling cloak. Then at last she saw him descending the staircase with measured steps. Lucian Ravensheir was taller than she remembered from their brief courtship meetings. Broad shoulders, dark hair touched faintly with silver near the temples. His expression carried the distant stillness of a man who had buried too many emotions for too many years. Candlelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face as he reached the final step. For one impossible moment, Evelyn thought he might finally look at her. Instead, his gaze passed over her shoulder toward the servant beside the door. "See that the Duchess is settled into the East Chambers," he said calmly. "Dinner will be served at 8. Evelyn's breath caught softly. Not once had his. Eyes met hers. "Your Grace," she said quietly, forcing dignity into her trembling voice. Lucian paused only briefly. "You must be exhausted from the journey." His tone remained polite, distant, cold enough to frost glass. Then he turned away without another word and disappeared into the western corridor, leaving the faint scent of cedar smoke lingering behind him. Silence settled heavily through the hall. The servants lowered their eyes with practiced discomfort. No one seemed surprised. Evelyn stood motionless beneath the chandeliers, feeling humiliation spread slowly through her chest, like winter creeping beneath a locked door. She had known the marriage would not be born of affection. Her father's debts had made certain of that. But she had not prepared herself for this strange invisibility, for the terrible ache of being acknowledged only as obligation. The butler cleared his throat gently. "If your Grace would follow me." Evelyn nodded once and climbed the grand staircase, her footsteps swallowed by the enormous house. Portraits lined the corridor walls. Ravensheir brides dressed in velvet and lace watched her pass with solemn painted eyes. At the far end of the hall, one portrait stood covered beneath a black silk veil. Evelyn slowed instinctively. "Who is she?" she asked softly. The butler hesitated. "The late Duchess of Ravensheir, ma'am." Something tightened painfully in Evelyn's chest. Even unseen, the dead woman still occupied the center of this house. Perhaps even the center of Lucian's soul. Her bedroom doors opened at last. A magnificent chamber greeted her, filled with candlelight, pale curtains, and a roaring fireplace. Beautiful, elegant, empty. Evelyn stepped inside slowly while servants unpacked her trunks in silence. Then her eyes drifted toward the adjoining door near the fireplace. Large, black, locked from the other side. "The Duke's chambers?" she asked quietly. "No, Your Grace," the maid answered carefully. "His Grace resides in the West Wing." Evelyn looked toward the locked door for a long moment while thunder rolled across the distant hills. Husband and wife, separated before the marriage had even begun. Somewhere deep inside Blackthorne Hall, a clock struck 8 times into the silence. And for the first time since becoming Duchess of Ravensheir, Evelyn realized she had not entered a marriage at all. She had entered a mausoleum built for a love that had died years before she arrived. The following weeks settled over Blackthorne Hall like heavy snowfall upon forgotten graves. Every morning, Evelyn descended the grand staircase precisely at 8 o'clock, her hands folded calmly before her, while servants prepared breakfast beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. And every morning, Duke Lucien Ravenshire was already seated at the far end of the endless dining table, dressed immaculately in dark wool and silver cufflinks, reading correspondence beside untouched black coffee that had long gone cold. The first morning, Evelyn believed perhaps he had simply been distracted. The second, she convinced herself grief made people distant. By the third week, she understood the painful truth. Lucien was not avoiding conversation. He was avoiding her. "Will His Grace be attending the autumn charity gala next month?" she asked softly one morning, attempting once again to bridge the unbearable silence between them. Lucien folded a letter carefully without lifting his eyes. "I have not decided." His voice carried no cruelty. That almost made it worse. Cruelty at least required emotion. Evelyn lowered her gaze to her untouched tea. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows while silver light filtered through the gray morning clouds. Somewhere in the west corridor, a grandfather clock chimed the half-hour. Lucien rose immediately. "You should order additional coal for the northern guest rooms," he said while fastening his gloves. "Winter will arrive early this year." Then he left without another word. Evelyn remained seated long after the doors closed behind him. The servants moved quietly around the room, pretending not to notice the loneliness sitting at the head of the Duchess's table. Blackthorne Hall itself seemed built from silence. Endless corridors swallowed footsteps whole. Candle flames trembled inside iron sconces while cold drafts moved through hidden cracks in the ancient stone walls. At night, Evelyn often wandered the eastern library, unable to sleep, wrapped in wool shawls while storms murmured beyond the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. She began learning the habits of the house the way one learned the breathing patterns of a sleeping stranger. The west wing remained locked after dark. The servants lowered their voices whenever the late Duchess was mentioned. Fresh white roses appeared every Sunday beneath the veiled portrait in the upstairs corridor. No one spoke of who placed them there. But Evelyn knew. One evening, nearly a month after the wedding, she stood beside the second-floor balcony watching snow begin to fall across the distant hills when footsteps echoed below. Lucien crossed the entrance hall alone, still dressed in his dark overcoat from the city. Snow clung to his shoulders. His face looked exhausted beneath the dim candlelight, shadows hollowing the sharp lines beneath his eyes. Evelyn's breath caught softly. He looked less like a duke in that moment, and more like a man carrying something unbearably heavy. "Your Grace," she called gently from above before she could stop herself. Lucien paused at the foot of the staircase. For one fleeting second, Evelyn thought he might finally look up at her. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the snowfall beyond the windows. "You should not stand in drafts this late," he said quietly. "The hall becomes cold after sunset." Then he continued toward the western corridor. Evelyn watched him disappear once more into darkness. But this time something lingered uneasily in her chest. Not anger, not humiliation, concern. Because beneath the distance and silence, she had begun noticing small things others overlooked. The untouched whiskey glasses left in his study each night. The faint tremor in his hands when thunder echoed too suddenly. The exhaustion darkening his features every morning as though sleep itself refused him peace. And sometimes, very late after midnight, when all of Blackthorne Hall had fallen silent beneath winter winds, Evelyn heard footsteps pacing endlessly across the floor above her chambers. Back and forth, like a man being haunted by something only he could see. By December, Evelyn had memorized every silence inside Blackthorne Hall. She knew which staircases creaked after midnight and which fireplaces burned hotter against the winter drafts. She knew the servants avoided the western corridor after dark, and that no one ever entered the third-floor wing overlooking the frozen gardens. Most of all, she knew Lucien Ravenshire carried grief the way some men carried scars. Quietly, permanently. The snowstorm arrived just before Christmas, burying the cliffs and surrounding roads beneath nearly 3 feet of ice and white wind. Blackthorne Hall became isolated from the rest of the world, suspended beneath gray skies and endless snowfall. That evening, Evelyn wandered through the upper corridors while servants prepared dinner below. Candlelight flickered softly against the stone walls as cold air slipped through unseen cracks in the ancient manor. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and paused once more before the veiled portrait hanging at the end of the corridor. The late Duchess. Evelyn had passed it nearly every day for weeks, yet no one ever spoke her name aloud. Tonight, however, something felt different. The black silk veil covering the portrait had shifted slightly, perhaps disturbed by the draft moving through the hall. Before she could stop herself, Evelyn stepped closer. Her fingers trembled faintly as she reached toward the fabric. She hesitated only a second before carefully lifting the veil aside. The woman beneath was breathtakingly beautiful. Auburn hair framed delicate features softened by candlelight and oil paint. Her eyes held warmth, life, joy untouched by sorrow. Evelyn stared quietly at the portrait while something painful settled in her chest. This was the woman Lucien had truly loved. The woman who still haunted every room inside Blackthorne Hall. You should not uncover that portrait. Lucien's voice cut through the silence behind her. Evelyn startled violently, nearly dropping the veil as she turned. He stood several feet away in the dim corridor, dressed entirely in black, one gloved hand resting against the staircase rail. Snow melted slowly from his overcoat onto the marble floor. For once, his composure had cracked slightly. His face looked pale, tense. "I apologize," Evelyn said softly, lowering her eyes. "I did not mean disrespect." Lucien crossed the corridor slowly and stopped beside her. Candlelight flickered across the portrait between them. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then at last his gaze lifted toward the painted woman beneath the veil, and something inside him seemed to hollow out completely. Her name was Eleanor, he said quietly. It was the first personal thing he had ever told her. Evelyn glanced toward him carefully. She was very beautiful. Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes. Silence returned between them, heavy as snowfall. Evelyn expected him to leave as he always did. Instead, he remained motionless before the portrait, staring at it with the exhausted expression of a man trapped between memory and punishment. Then she noticed something strange. Near the bottom corner of the painting rested a small cluster of dried white roses tied with silver ribbon. Fresh snow still clung faintly to the stems. He had placed them there himself. Tonight, the servants still speak of her kindly, Evelyn said gently, unsure why she was speaking at all. Lucien let out a faint, humorless breath. The servants remember the version of her that smiled during dinner parties. His eyes darkened slightly. They do not remember the last winter. Something cold moved through Evelyn at the quiet heaviness in his voice. Before she could respond, Lucien stepped back abruptly as though he had already revealed too much. "You should return downstairs," he said, his expression hardening once more behind familiar distance. The corridors become colder after dark. Evelyn nodded softly, though neither of them moved immediately. For one impossible moment, they simply stood there together beneath flickering candlelight, while snow battered the windows beyond the hall. Then Lucien reached forward and gently lowered the black veil over Eleanor's portrait once again. His gloved fingers lingered against the silk for only a second. But Evelyn saw it clearly, the slight tremor in his hand. And suddenly she understood something terrifying about the Duke of Ravensshire. He was not merely mourning his wife. He was living inside the ruins of her memory, punishing himself every day for something he could neither forget nor forgive. The annual winter gathering at Blackthorne Hall had once been the pride of Northern society. At least, that was what the servants whispered while preparing the ballroom beneath glittering chandeliers and candlelight reflected against polished marble floors. Evelyn listened quietly as maids pinned silver combs into her hair and adjusted the deep blue velvet gown chosen for the evening. "It is the first gathering His Grace has hosted in nearly 5 years," one young maid murmured softly. Many believed the ballroom would never reopen after the late Duchess passed. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward her gloved hands resting in her lap. 5 years. Even joy inside this house had been buried alongside Eleanor Ravensshire. Outside, snow drifted heavily against the tall windows while carriages rolled steadily toward the estate through the storm. By 7 o'clock, Blackthorne Hall glowed with music, crystal light, and voices echoing through rooms that had remained silent for years. Noblemen gathered beside roaring fireplaces while women in silk and pearls moved like painted figures beneath the chandeliers. Yet despite the warmth surrounding her, Evelyn felt painfully alone, standing near the edge of the ballroom. Lucien had not entered with her. He rarely stood beside her in public unless required by propriety. And tonight seemed no different. "The new Duchess is lovely," someone whispered nearby. "Yes, though hardly comparable to Eleanor." Another voice sighed softly. "Poor thing. Everyone knows she was married only to settle her father's debts." Evelyn kept her expression composed even as the words struck quietly against her chest. She had long learned that humiliation delivered politely often cut deepest of all. Across the ballroom, Lucian stood beside several aristocrats near the grand staircase. Tall, immaculate, untouchable. Candlelight flickered across the sharp angles of his face while snow swirled beyond the towering windows behind him. Women still watched him when he crossed a room. Men lowered their voices in his presence. Yet despite the crowd surrounding him, he looked entirely alone. Evelyn looked away first. Music swelled softly through the ballroom as another cluster of guests passed beside her. "I heard the Duke still keeps his first wife's chambers untouched. Can you blame him? Some men love only once. Then why marry again? Duty, perhaps. Certainly not affection." A quiet laugh followed. "The poor Duchess looks more like a guest than a wife." Evelyn's fingers tightened faintly around her fan. She should have walked away. Instead, she remained perfectly still beneath the chandeliers while every whispered word settled heavier inside her chest. Because the cruelest part was not that society pitted her. It was that they were correct. Suddenly, the orchestra faltered for a brief moment as movement stirred near the staircase. Lucian had turned. His gaze settled directly upon the women whispering nearby. Silence spread almost immediately through that corner of the ballroom. The older woman nearest the fireplace straightened visibly beneath the weight of his attention. Lucian said nothing. He did not defend Evelyn. He did not confront anyone. Yet the coldness in his expression silenced every voice around them more effectively than anger ever could. Then, slowly, his eyes shifted toward Evelyn. The room seemed to hold its breath. It was the longest he had looked at her since their wedding day. Not through her. At her. Something unreadable moved behind his gray eyes before he crossed the ballroom with measured steps. Conversations softened as guests discreetly watched him approach his wife. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled painfully inside her chest. Lucian stopped beside her, close enough that she caught the faint scent of winter air and cedar lingering on his coat. "The west windows are drafty," he said quietly. "You should not stand here long." Evelyn blinked in surprise. Of all things, that was what he chose to say. Not comfort, not affection, concern hidden carefully behind formality. But before she could answer, Lord Pembroke approached with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Your Grace," he greeted Lucian warmly, before turning toward Evelyn. "The Duchess grows lovelier each season. Blackthorne Hall must finally feel alive again." Something dark flickered briefly across Lucian's face. Fast enough most would miss it. But Evelyn saw it clearly. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before his gaze drifted toward the ballroom around them. "Some things," he said quietly, "should not be spoken of lightly." Lord Pembroke's smile faltered immediately. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then Lucian stepped away once more without another word, disappearing back into the crowd before Evelyn could even steady her breathing. But long after he vanished among the candlelight and music, one impossible realization remained echoing through her chest. For the first time since their marriage began, Lucian Ravensshire had noticed when she was cold. The storm worsened 3 nights after the winter gathering. Wind clawed against Blackthorne Hall with such force that the ancient windows trembled softly within their frames. Snow buried the gardens beneath layers of white silence, while the cliffs beyond the estate vanished completely beneath gray skies and frozen mist. Inside the manor, most of the servants retired early, retreating from the cold drafts, moving restlessly through the corridors. But Evelyn could not sleep. The ballroom whispers still lingered unpleasantly in her thoughts. More than that, Lucian's strange behavior haunted her. The way he had crossed the room to stand beside her. The quiet concern hidden beneath formal words. It was little, barely anything at all. Yet inside a marriage built entirely from silence, even the smallest warmth felt dangerous. Wrapped in a dark wool shawl, Evelyn wandered into the East Library shortly after midnight. The fire had nearly died, leaving only soft amber embers glowing beneath the grate. She knelt quietly to place another log onto the flames when a sudden gust rattled the windows violently overhead. Somewhere deeper inside the manor, a door slammed shut. Evelyn startled softly and rose at once. Blackthorne Hall felt different tonight. Restless, alive with unseen tension moving through its endless halls. She stepped into the corridor carrying a candle lantern while shadows stretched along the stone walls around her. Wind moaned faintly through distant staircases. As she passed the west corridor leading toward Lucien's private study, something caught her attention. A thin line of light glowed beneath the study door. He was awake again. Evelyn hesitated only briefly before approaching. She did not intend to disturb him, only to ensure the fire remained lit during the storm. Yet as she neared the door, another violent gust swept through the corridor. The old manor groaned softly around her. Then suddenly the study door creaked open several inches on its own. Evelyn froze. Warm firelight flickered through the narrow opening. "Your Grace?" she called gently. No answer came. Concern stirred uneasily inside her chest. Slowly, she pushed the door wider. Lucien's study stood empty. The fireplace still burned low beside towering shelves of leather-bound books, while rain lashed against the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. Papers covered the massive mahogany desk in careful disorder. One whiskey glass rested untouched beside dying candlelight. Evelyn stepped cautiously inside. "Your Grace." Silence answered her once more. Then another gust rushed through the chimney, scattering loose pages across the carpet. One sheet drifted near the fireplace where glowing embers licked dangerously close to the parchment. Evelyn hurried forward to retrieve it before the corner caught flame. But as she lifted the page, she realized it was not a document at all. It was a letter. The edges had already blackened from fire. Half the page remained burned away completely. Her eyes lowered instinctively toward the surviving lines written in elegant feminine script. "Lucien, if you are reading this, then I was too much of a coward to tell you the truth myself." Evelyn's breath caught sharply. "Eleanor." The signature at the bottom confirmed it instantly. Her hands trembled faintly as candlelight flickered across the page. The remaining lines were fragmented by scorch marks and ash. "The doctor warned me the illness would worsen before winter ended. You must not blame yourself for what happened that night. None of it was your fault." Evelyn stared at the words while cold unease settled through her chest. Illness? Fault. Her eyes moved quickly over the burned page, searching for answers hidden between ruined sentences. Then footsteps sounded suddenly behind her. Heavy. Immediate. Evelyn turned sharply. Lucien stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable beneath flickering firelight. Snow dusted his dark coat and damp strands of hair clung faintly to his forehead from the storm outside. But it was his eyes that made Evelyn's pulse falter. They had fallen instantly upon the letter trembling in her hands. Silence crashed between them like thunder. Lucien crossed the room in 3 swift steps before gently, but firmly taking the paper from her grasp. His jaw tightened as he stared down at the burned edges. "You should not be here," he said quietly. Not angry. Somehow worse. His voice sounded tired beyond words. Evelyn swallowed carefully. "I did not mean to invade your privacy." Lucien folded the letter slowly, his gloved fingers trembling once before stilling again. "Then why?" he asked softly without looking at her. "Does it feel as though every locked door inside this house eventually opens around you?" The storm did not ease by morning. If anything, the world beyond Blackthorne Hall seemed to disappear completely beneath endless snow and violent wind. Servants struggled to keep the fireplaces alive while icy drafts moved through the ancient corridors like restless spirits. Shortly after breakfast, the head groundskeeper arrived pale-faced at the entrance hall with news that the northern road had collapsed beneath drifting snow and fallen trees. No carriage would leave the estate for several days. Blackthorne Hall was trapped inside winter. Evelyn stood near the staircase, listening quietly, while Lucien gave calm instructions to the household staff. His voice remained steady despite the chaos surrounding them. More coal for the east wing. Double blankets for the servants' quarters. Hot broth prepared every 4 hours. He noticed everything. Every weakness. Every danger. Yet somehow never himself. By evening, the storm turned worse. The wind screamed against the windows hard enough to shake the glass, while snow buried the lower doors completely. Around midnight, the power from the estate generators failed without warning. Blackthorne Hall plunged instantly into darkness. A startled cry echoed somewhere downstairs, followed by hurried footsteps and distant voices. Evelyn rose quickly from her chair beside the dying fireplace inside her chambers. The sudden silence felt unnerving without the constant hum of electric light. Only moonlight and storm flashes remained beyond the windows. She reached for her candle lantern and stepped cautiously into the corridor where servants hurried through the darkness, relighting wall sconces one by one. The west fireplaces are failing, one maid whispered anxiously while passing her. The chimneys are freezing over. Evelyn's chest tightened faintly. The west wing. Lucien's study. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she gathered another wool shawl and made her way through the freezing corridors. Candle flames flickered wildly as wind rattled the manor around her. By the time she reached the west study, cold air had already begun slipping beneath the doors. Evelyn pushed inside quickly. The fire had nearly gone out completely. Lucien stood near the tall windows staring into the storm outside, while snow swirled violently beyond the glass. Shadows carved exhaustion into the sharp lines of his face beneath the weak candlelight. He looked over as she entered, surprise flickering briefly across his expression. "You should not be wandering the halls," he said quietly. "The temperature is dropping quickly." Evelyn crossed toward the fireplace without answering. "The servants are struggling to restore the generators," she said softly while kneeling beside the hearth. "If this fire dies, the pipes in the west wing may freeze by morning." Lucien watched silently as she added fresh logs to the embers and carefully coaxed the flames higher. Smoke curled softly upward while warmth slowly returned to the room inch by inch. Neither spoke for several moments. Only the storm filled the silence between them. Then suddenly another violent gust struck the manor. The lights from the remaining hallway sconces outside extinguished instantly. Darkness swallowed the corridor beyond the study. Evelyn startled softly at the thunderous sound that followed. Before she realized what she was doing, her hand tightened instinctively against the edge of Lucien's desk. Lucien noticed immediately. "You are frightened of storms," he said quietly. It was not a question. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Only the louder ones. Something softened almost invisibly in his expression before vanishing again beneath restraint. He crossed the room and placed another candle beside her near the hearth. "This wing is structurally sound," he said in that same calm voice. "Nothing will happen to you here. To you, not us." Yet somehow the words still warmed something unexpectedly fragile inside her chest. The fire crackled stronger now, casting amber light across the dark wood walls and towering shelves around them. Outside, snow battered the windows relentlessly while Blackthorne Hall groaned beneath winter's fury. Evelyn rose slowly from beside the hearth, brushing ash from her gloves. "The servants may need assistance downstairs," she murmured. But before she could step away, another crash thundered through the manor. Somewhere deeper in the west wing, glass shattered violently. Evelyn gasped softly as the floor beneath them trembled. Instantly Lucien moved forward, one hand steadying her arm before she lost balance. The contact lasted barely seconds. Yet the warmth of his gloved hand against her sleeve sent unexpected tension through the silence between them. Lucien released her immediately, as though remembering himself too late. But neither stepped away at once. They simply stood there beside the fire while storm shadows flickered across the room and snow raged beyond the windows. For the first time since entering Blackthorne Hall, Evelyn realized something terrifying. The Duke no longer looked through her completely, and perhaps that frightened him more than the storm ever could. The storm trapped them inside the west wing until nearly dawn. Snow continued hammering the windows while freezing wind screamed across the cliffs beyond Blackthorne Hall like something alive in the darkness. The servants had retreated downstairs to protect the lower fireplaces, leaving the upper corridors strangely silent except for the crackling fire inside Lucien's study. Evelyn remained near the hearth adding wood whenever the flames weakened. The temperature had fallen sharply over the last hour. Even inside the manor, cold crept through the stone walls and settled into her bones. Lucien stood near the desk, sorting through correspondence by candlelight, though Evelyn noticed he had not truly read a single page for several minutes. His attention drifted repeatedly toward the storm outside, as though expecting something terrible to emerge from it. Another gust rattled the windows violently. Evelyn flinched instinctively before quickly steadying herself. Lucien noticed. He always noticed now. "You should rest," he said quietly without looking up. "You have been awake most of the night." Evelyn shook her head lightly while kneeling beside the hearth once more. The fire will not hold unless someone tends it. She reached deeper into the grate to reposition one of the fallen logs just as a burst of sparks snapped outward unexpectedly. Heat stung sharply across her bare fingers before she pulled back at once with a soft gasp. Lucien looked up instantly. Evelyn. The sound of her name in his voice startled her more than the burn itself. He crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her before she could protest. Let me see. It is nothing, she whispered automatically. But Lucien had already taken her hand gently into his own. Candlelight flickered across his features while he examined the reddened skin along her fingers. His touch remained careful, controlled. Yet Evelyn felt her heartbeat stumble painfully at the simple warmth of his hands surrounding hers. You burned yourself keeping this room warm, he said quietly. There was no accusation in his voice, only something far more dangerous. Guilt. Evelyn tried to pull away lightly. The servants have enough responsibilities tonight. Lucien did not release her immediately. His thumb brushed faintly against her wrist as he studied the injury beneath the firelight. Then at last he rose without a word and crossed toward the cabinet beside his desk. He returned, moments later carrying a small tin of salve and clean linen bandages. Evelyn watched him in stunned silence. Your Grace, truly, there is no need. There is. The answer came softly, firmly. Lucien sat beside her near the fire and carefully applied the cooling salve to her fingertips while snow battered the windows behind them. Neither spoke for several moments. The only sound came from the storm and the low crackling flames between them. Evelyn could not stop watching his face. Up close, exhaustion shadowed every sharp angle beneath his eyes. Fine lines marked the corners of his expression as though grief itself had carved them there over years of sleepless nights. Yet for the first time since their marriage began, Lucien did not seem distant. He seemed tired. Human. Does it pain you? He asked quietly while wrapping the linen around her hand. Evelyn looked down at him beside the firelight. Not anymore. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his face at those words. Then his gaze lifted fully to hers. It happened so suddenly Evelyn nearly stopped breathing. Lucien was truly looking at her. Not through her. Not beyond her. At her. His gray eyes lingered over details he had ignored for months. The exhaustion beneath her own eyes from restless nights. The loosened strands of chestnut hair escaping her braid. The trembling she tried to hide each time thunder shook the manor walls. And suddenly Evelyn understood something terrifying. Lucien had spent months avoiding her because seeing her clearly required him to feel something again. The realization seemed to strike him at the same moment. His expression tightened almost painfully before he released her hand too quickly and rose to his feet. Distance returned instantly between them like a door slamming shut. Lucien turned toward the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel while snow shadows flickered across the room. You should have hated me by now, he said quietly. Evelyn stared at him in confusion. For what? A long silence followed. Then Lucien gave a faint, humorless smile without looking back at her. For marrying a man, he said softly, who has spent every day pretending you were not. There. The fire burned lower as the night stretched toward dawn. Outside the windows, the storm still raged across the cliffs, though the wind had softened slightly beneath the heavy snowfall. Blackthorne Hall groaned quietly around them like an old ship weathering dark waters. Evelyn remained seated near the hearth, her bandaged hand resting gently in her lap, while candlelight flickered across the shadows beneath her eyes. Across the room, Lucien stood unmoving beside the fireplace mantel, one hand braced against the dark wood as though the weight inside him had finally become too heavy to carry upright. Silence lingered between them for several long moments after his confession. You should have hated me by now. The words still echoed softly through the room. Evelyn lowered her gaze toward the glowing embers. Hatred requires anger, she said quietly, and I do not think you ever meant to hurt me. Lucien let out a faint breath that almost resembled bitter laughter. No, he admitted softly. I only failed you in every quieter way possible. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than distance ever had. Evelyn looked toward him carefully. Why? Lucien closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, but she saw it clearly. Exhaustion, shame, fear hidden beneath years of restraint. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded lower than before, rawer somehow beneath the storm outside. Because looking at you became dangerous. Evelyn's breath caught faintly. Lucien turned slowly then, his gray eyes meeting hers fully across the firelight. At first, I convinced myself this marriage would remain practical. Distant. Easier for both of us that way. He swallowed once before continuing. But every time you entered a room, I became aware of you. Evelyn could not look away now. Lucien's gaze remained fixed upon her with an intensity she had never seen before. The way you thanked servants no one else noticed. The way you walked through this house as though trying to bring warmth back into it without disturbing the dead. His jaw tightened faintly, and I hated myself for seeing it. The fire crackled softly between them. Evelyn's heartbeat felt painfully loud. Inside the silence. You loved her, she whispered carefully. Lucien looked away at once. Something dark crossed his expression. I still do. The answer should have wounded her more than it did. Instead, she found herself watching the grief hollowing his features beneath candlelight and realizing how completely it had consumed him. Then why punish yourself for surviving her? She asked softly. Lucien froze. For a moment, even the storm outside seemed to fall silent. Slowly, his eyes returned to hers. Because she died believing I blamed her. The confession came barely above a whisper. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. Lucien crossed toward the desk and rested both hands against its edge, staring down at the flickering candle beside the burned letter still lying there. Eleanor became ill during our final winter together, he said quietly. The doctors warned her condition would worsen, but she concealed it from everyone, even me. His voice roughened slightly. The night she collapsed, we argued first. Evelyn remained perfectly still. Lucien swallowed hard before continuing. I told her she had become reckless with her health, that she was exhausting herself trying to please everyone around her. His eyes darkened with remembered pain, and she looked at me as though I had become a stranger. The fire snapped softly behind them. Those were among the last coherent words she ever heard from me. Silence settled heavily through the room once more. Evelyn felt tears sting faintly behind her eyes, though she fought to keep her composure. Years. He had carried this alone for years. Lucien, she whispered gently. He shook his head immediately. Do not. His voice cracked quietly beneath restraint. Do not offer comfort for something you do not fully understand. But Evelyn rose slowly anyway. Candlelight trembled softly across the room as she crossed toward him. Lucien stared down at the floor as though unable to meet her eyes now that the truth had finally escaped him. Then Evelyn stopped only inches away and spoke the words that shattered something inside him completely. Grief is not love's grave, your grace. Lucien looked up sharply. His expression faltered. For the first time since she had known him. Truly faltered. And standing there beneath storm shadows and dying candlelight, Evelyn watched the Duke of Ravensshire finally begin to break beneath the weight of his own sorrow. Morning arrived slowly after the storm, pale winter lights spilling across Blackthorne Hall through windows frosted with ice. The snow had finally stopped sometime near dawn, leaving the cliffs and gardens buried beneath untouched white silence. Yet inside the manor, something had shifted almost imperceptibly during the night. The servants sensed it before anyone spoke of it aloud. Evelyn noticed it first at breakfast. She entered the dining room expecting the familiar emptiness waiting at opposite ends of the endless table. Instead, Lucien was already standing beside her chair when she arrived. Not seated. Waiting. The sight startled her enough that she nearly faltered mid-step. Good morning, he said quietly. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet Evelyn realized with sudden disbelief that it was the first genuine greeting he had ever offered her. She lowered her eyes quickly to steady herself. Good morning, Your Grace. Lucien pulled out her chair before returning silently to his own seat across from her. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but the elderly butler standing near the wall blinked in visible surprise before immediately lowering his gaze again. Breakfast passed mostly in silence, though not the painful silence Evelyn had grown accustomed to enduring. This one felt different, softer somehow. Lucien no longer buried himself completely behind newspapers and correspondence. Twice she caught him glancing toward her before quickly looking away again, as though still unaccustomed to allowing himself such things. You have not touched your tea, he observed quietly at one point. Evelyn looked up in mild surprise. It has grown cold. Without another word, Lucien reached for the silver pot beside him and poured her fresh tea himself. The movement was smooth, natural. Yet Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled painfully all the same. Across the room, the younger footman nearly dropped an entire tray of china. Lucien either did not notice or pretended not to. After breakfast, Evelyn spent several hours assisting the housekeeper with repairs needed after the storm. Frozen pipes had damaged portions of the east corridor, and several servants had developed coughs after working overnight in the cold. Near noon, while carrying fresh linens toward the lower guest rooms, Evelyn paused outside the servants' quarters after hearing quiet laughter inside. His Grace asked whether the Duchess had eaten breakfast this morning. One maid whispered in astonishment. Asked twice. Another servant lowered her voice dramatically. Perhaps the storm frightened him into remembering he had a wife. Soft laughter followed. Evelyn quickly continued walking before embarrassment colored her cheeks too deeply. Yet despite herself, warmth lingered faintly in her chest the rest of the afternoon. By evening, snowlight reflected silver against the windows, while fires crackled steadily throughout the manor once more. Evelyn entered the drawing room expecting solitude, only to stop short at the sight awaiting her. Lucien sat near the fireplace reading beside a tray prepared for two. Candlelight softened the sharp shadows usually carved into his features. He looked up as she entered. I thought, he said after the briefest hesitation, perhaps you should not dine alone tonight. Evelyn's breath caught softly. The room suddenly felt smaller somehow. Warmer. She moved slowly toward the chair opposite him, while her pulse fluttered uncontrollably beneath her ribs. Throughout dinner, conversation came carefully, unevenly. Yet for the first time, it existed at all. Lucien asked about her childhood estate in Connecticut before her family moved permanently to England. Evelyn learned he preferred winter over summer because silence felt less lonely beneath snowfall. Small things, fragile things, but each moment chipped quietly at the distance that had once seemed impossible to cross. Then, halfway through the meal, Evelyn laughed softly at one of his unexpectedly dry remarks about London society. The sound escaped before she could stop it. Lucien froze completely. The fire crackled between them while candlelight flickered across the table. Untouched, Evelyn's smile faded slightly beneath the intensity of his gaze. What is it? She asked gently. Lucien stared at her for one long breath before answering. Nothing. But his voice sounded quieter now, almost shaken. His eyes remained fixed upon her face another second too long before he finally looked away toward the fire. And though he said nothing more, Evelyn realized something undeniable in that moment. Lucien Ravensheyer was beginning to fear the very thing he had spent months trying to avoid. He was starting to enjoy her presence far more than he should. Winter settled deeply over Blackthorne Hall during the weeks that followed, but for the first time since Evelyn's arrival, the manor no longer felt entirely frozen. The changes remained small enough that no outsider would notice them. Yet within the quiet rhythms of the house, they became impossible to ignore. Lucien no longer vanished immediately after breakfast. Some evenings he remained in the drawing room, while Evelyn played softly upon the old piano near the fire. Other nights he joined her for tea beside the library windows while snow drifted silently across the cliffs outside. He still carried grief like a shadow stitched into his soul. But now, occasionally, warmth managed to reach him through the darkness. That frightened him more than anything. Evelyn saw it each time his gaze lingered too long upon her before abruptly retreating again. One afternoon, while organizing correspondence in the east sitting room, Evelyn discovered an old household ledger tucked carelessly between newer records. She would have ignored it entirely had one folded document not slipped free onto the carpet beside her feet. The paper was aged and yellowed at the edges, bearing the seal of Blackthorne Hall's former physician. Curiosity stirred uneasily within her as she unfolded the note. Her eyes moved quickly across the faded handwriting. Duchess Eleanor Ravensheyer continues concealing the severity of her condition from His Grace. Her lungs weaken further with each passing month. Emotional distress and physical exhaustion may accelerate the decline considerably if precautions are not taken immediately. Evelyn's breath caught softly. She read the lines again more carefully, while something painful tightened in her chest. Eleanor had been dying long before the final winter. The realization struck heavily against everything Lucien believed about himself. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn startled and quickly folded the letter closed just as Mrs. Weatherby, the elderly housekeeper, entered carrying fresh linens. The older woman froze instantly upon seeing the paper in Evelyn's hands. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. Evelyn rose slowly. "Inside the household ledgers." Mrs. Weatherby set the linens down with visible unease. "That should have been destroyed years ago." Evelyn hesitated only briefly before asking the question haunting her thoughts. Did His Grace know how ill she truly was? Silence filled the room. The housekeeper's expression softened with old sorrow. "No," she admitted quietly. "The Duchess made certain of it." Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. Mrs. Weatherby moved closer toward the window, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. Her Grace feared becoming a burden to him. She believed if he knew the truth, he would spend every waking moment trying to save her instead of living beside her. Snow drifted softly outside the glass while the older woman continued in a voice heavy with memory. The night she collapsed, they argued because His Grace wanted to cancel the winter charity ball. The Duchess insisted the estate needed hope after such a difficult season. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her eyes sadly. He blamed himself afterward because those were the last strong words exchanged between them. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. All these years, Lucien had buried himself beneath guilt for something that had never truly belonged to him. Did Eleanor ever tell him otherwise? Evelyn asked softly. Mrs. Weatherby nodded toward the folded paper in her hands. That letter was written 3 days before she passed. Evelyn's fingers tightened faintly around the document. The burned letter from the study. The surviving words suddenly carried far deeper meaning now. "You must not blame yourself for what happened that night. None of it was your fault." Mrs. Weatherby sighed quietly. His Grace never forgave himself for failing to save her. Evelyn stared down at the faded physician's note while understanding settled painfully through her chest. Lucien had not only mourned Eleanor. He had sentenced himself alongside her memory. That evening, snow fell gently beyond the west library windows while Lucien stood near the fire reviewing estate accounts. Evelyn entered silently carrying the physician's letter hidden carefully beneath her shawl. Lucien looked up immediately upon seeing her. The warmth in his expression appeared before he could hide it. Small, fleeting, but real. Then his eyes drifted toward the paper in her hands. And slowly, all warmth vanished from his face at once. Lucien's eyes fixed instantly upon the folded physician's letter trembling faintly in Evelyn's hands. The warmth that had softened his expression moments earlier disappeared beneath sudden tension. Silence settled heavily through the West Library while firelight flickered across the shadows carved into his face. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. Evelyn stepped farther into the room, closing the door softly behind her. Snow drifted beyond the tall windows while the fire cracked low beside the shelves. "Inside the east sitting room," she answered gently. "It was hidden among the household ledgers." Lucien's jaw tightened. "You should not have read it." The coldness in his voice struck sharper than she expected. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly before gathering the courage to continue. "You believed Eleanor died because of your argument that night." Lucien turned away immediately. "This conversation is over." "No." The word escaped softer than intended, yet it stopped him all the same. Evelyn moved closer slowly, careful not to shatter the fragile stillness between them. "Lucien." She was already dying. He closed his eyes once. Hard, as though physically pained by hearing the truth spoken aloud. "Do not." His voice roughened beneath restraint. "You do not understand what happened." Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. "Then help me understand." Lucien stared into the fire for several long seconds before finally speaking. "The doctors told me she needed rest." His voice sounded distant now, trapped somewhere years behind them. But Eleanor insisted the estate depended on appearances, charity events, gatherings, smiles. A bitter laugh escaped him quietly. She spent her final winter pretending to be stronger than she was. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Lucien's hands curled tightly at his sides. The night of the ball, she collapsed halfway down the west staircase. Evelyn felt her breath catch faintly. "And I remember thinking," he stopped abruptly. His throat tightened visibly before he forced the words out anyway. "I remember thinking that if I had loved her better, perhaps she would have trusted me enough to stop pretending." Silence crashed heavily through the room. Evelyn stepped closer instinctively. "That is not your guilt to carry." Lucien looked at her then, truly looked at her. Pain darkened his gray eyes so deeply it almost frightened her. "You read the physician's report," he said softly. But you did not see the look in her eyes that final night. His voice nearly broke beneath the weight of memory. She looked disappointed in me. Evelyn shook her head gently. No. She looked heartbroken because she knew she was leaving you. Lucien stared at her in stunned silence. The fire crackled low between them, while snowlight reflected pale silver across the room. For one fragile moment, Evelyn thought something inside him might finally surrender. But then fear returned to his expression with brutal force. He stepped backward immediately, distance hardening once more between them. You should not concern yourself with ghosts, he said coldly. The sudden change cut through her like winter wind. Evelyn blinked softly in confusion. Lucien, I allowed this to go too far. His voice turned quieter now, colder. These conversations, these evenings together. Evelyn felt her chest tighten painfully. What are you saying? Lucien looked away from her entirely. I married you because duty required it. Every word landed carefully, deliberately, like a man forcing cruelty upon himself as much as her. But this house already buried one Duchess beneath grief. I will not destroy another by allowing false hopes to grow where they should not. Evelyn stared at him while humiliation and sorrow tangled painfully inside her chest. Only hours ago she had believed the distance between them was finally fading. Now she understood the terrifying truth. Lucien had begun caring for her enough to fear it, and fear always made wounded men retreat. She lowered her gaze slowly, fighting to keep her composure intact. I see, she whispered. Lucien did not answer. He could not. The silence between them stretched unbearably while the fire continued burning lower beside the windows. Then, without another word, Evelyn placed the physician's letter gently upon the desk and turned toward the door. Her hand trembled faintly against the brass handle. Evelyn. Lucien spoke her name softly behind her. Too softly. She paused but did not look back. You once asked why every locked door inside this house eventually opens around me, she said quietly. Perhaps because some part of you wanted to be found. Then she stepped into the corridor and closed the library door behind her, leaving Lucien Ravensheyer standing alone once more beside the ruins of a grief he no longer knew how to survive. The next morning, Evelyn requested that her trunks be packed. The decision spread quietly through Blackthorne Hall before breakfast had even ended. Servants lowered their voices as she passed through the corridors, while the housekeeper watched her with visible concern. Yet no one questioned her choice. Perhaps because everyone inside the manor understood the same painful truth. A woman could endure loneliness only so long before it hollowed her completely. Snow still covered the estate in endless white beneath pale winter skies when Evelyn stood inside her chambers folding the last of her dresses into traveling trunks. The adjoining door between her rooms and Lucien's remained locked as always. Cold, silent, final. She paused only once while fastening the clasp on her case. Her eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the frozen gardens where she had once begun believing impossible things. That perhaps grief could soften. That perhaps a wounded man might someday choose love again. A knock sounded softly behind her. Mrs. Weatherby entered carrying a fresh wool cloak draped carefully over her arms. The roads remained difficult, Your Grace, the older woman said gently. Perhaps another day would be wiser. Evelyn forced a faint smile. If I stay another day, I may lose the courage to leave it all. The housekeeper's expression softened sadly. And His Grace. Evelyn lowered her gaze. His Grace deserves peace. The words tasted like heartbreak. By dusk, the carriage had been prepared near the front steps despite the lingering snow. Wind moved softly through the frozen trees surrounding Blackthorne Hall, while lanterns glowed golden against the growing darkness. Evelyn descended the staircase slowly, one gloved hand resting against the polished rail. Each step felt strangely heavier than the last. Servants gathered quietly in the entrance hall to see her off. But Lucien did not appear. Of course he did not. Evelyn swallowed the ache rising painfully in her throat and continued toward the doors anyway. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the evening air while the coachman secured her luggage. Evelyn stepped toward the waiting carriage just as thunder rolled faintly across the distant cliffs. Then suddenly the front doors behind her burst open. Stop! Lucien's voice echoed sharply across the courtyard. Evelyn froze instantly. Footsteps crossed the stone path quickly behind her before Lucien appeared beside the carriage. breath uneven beneath the cold air. Snow clung to his dark coat, as though he had run through the storm itself to reach her. For several seconds neither spoke. The lantern light illuminated tension carved deeply across his face. Fear. Desperation. Emotion too raw to hide anymore. "You are leaving," he said quietly, as though only now realizing the reality before him. Evelyn forced herself to remain composed. "You made your wishes very clear." Lucien stared at her as though the thought physically wounded him. No, his voice broke softly beneath restraint. "I made my fears clear." Snow drifted silently around them, while servants pretended not to witness the unraveling of their duke in the middle of the courtyard. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. "Lucien." He stepped closer abruptly, gray eyes fixed entirely upon her now with terrifying intensity. "I spent years convincing myself grief was loyalty," he said hoarsely. "That if I punished myself long enough, somehow it would honor Eleanor's memory." His hands trembled faintly at his sides. "Then you walked into this house and brought warmth back into rooms I thought would remain dead forever." Evelyn could barely breathe. Lucien swallowed hard before continuing. "Do you know why I refused to look at you after our wedding?" Tears burned faintly behind Evelyn's eyes as she shook her head once. Lucien's expression shattered completely then. "Because once I truly saw you," he whispered, "I knew I would never survive losing you too." Silence fell between them beneath the drifting snow. The confession lingered in the cold air like something sacred and irreversible. Lucien stepped closer still until only inches separated them beside the waiting carriage. His voice lowered almost painfully soft now. "Look at me, Evelyn." She did. And for the first time since their marriage began, there were no ghosts standing between them anymore. Only a man terrified by how deeply he had come to love the woman he once tried so desperately not to see. Winter began loosening its grip on Blackthorne Hall by early March. Snow still covered portions of the cliffs beyond the estate, but sunlight lingered longer each evening now, spilling gold across the frozen gardens where the first signs of spring quietly emerged beneath melting ice. Inside the manor, warmth had returned in ways no servant dared speak of aloud, though everyone felt it. The west wing no longer remained locked after dark. Music drifted once more through the drawing room some evenings. Fresh flowers appeared along the staircases where only dust and silence had lived for years. And for the first time since Eleanor Ravenshire's death, laughter occasionally echoed through Blackthorne Hall without sounding like an intrusion. Evelyn stood near the library windows one afternoon, watching snowmelt slide softly from the rooftops when familiar footsteps approached behind her. She smiled faintly before Lucien even spoke. "Mrs. Weatherby insists the gardeners are planting roses too early this season," he said quietly while stopping beside her. "She claims another frost will destroy them." Evelyn glanced toward him with gentle amusement. "And what do you think?" Lucien's gray eyes settled upon her immediately. They always did now. "I think this house has spent enough years expecting winter to last forever." The softness in his voice still startled her sometimes. Not because it felt unfamiliar anymore, but because she knew how difficult it had once been for him to allow himself tenderness at all. Lucien reached for her hand slowly, his thumb brushing lightly across the fading mark left by the burn she had earned during the storm months ago. Such a small scar. Yet every time he touched it, guilt and gratitude flickered together behind his eyes. "The physician from London arrives tomorrow," he said after a moment. "Mrs. Weatherby's cough has worsened again." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "You notice everything now?" Lucien let out the faintest breath of laughter. "No." His gaze softened further while sunlight moved across her face beside the window. "Only the things that matter." Her heartbeat stumbled quietly at the words. Even now, after everything, he could still undo her with the smallest sentences. Somewhere downstairs, servants moved through the halls preparing for the evening gathering Lucien had insisted upon hosting despite his old hatred of social events. Blackthorne Hall had slowly reopened itself to the world over recent weeks. Not because grief had disappeared, but because grief no longer ruled every room inside the estate. Later that evening, candlelight flooded the ballroom once more while music drifted softly beneath crystal chandeliers. Guests filled the manor with conversation and warmth as snow continued melting quietly beyond the tall windows. Evelyn descended the staircase in silver silk, with Lucien waiting below. The moment his eyes lifted toward her, The entire room seemed to disappear around them. There had once been a time when he could not bear to look at her at all. Now he looked as though forgetting to would destroy him. Lucian crossed toward her slowly through the candlelight until only inches separated them at the foot of the stairs. "You are staring again, Your Grace," Evelyn murmured softly. A faint smile touched his mouth. "Rare still, but real. I spent too long pretending not to." The orchestra began another waltz somewhere beyond them, while guests moved gracefully across the polished floor. Yet Lucian remained standing before her, as though the rest of the world no longer held much importance. "Dance with me," he said quietly. Evelyn's breath caught. Months ago, such a request would have been unimaginable. She placed her hand gently into his. Lucian drew her carefully into the ballroom, where candlelight flickered gold against marble floors and warm music echoed through Blackthorne Hall once more. As they moved together beneath the chandeliers, Evelyn felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Not from fear this time, from certainty. Lucian lowered his head just enough for only her to hear his next words. "You once said grief was not love's grave." His voice softened further. "I think you were the first person who ever taught me that surviving loss does not mean betraying the people we once loved." Evelyn looked up at him while emotion tightened painfully in her chest. The man holding her now no longer resembled the cold stranger who had once walked past her without a glance. This Lucian carried scars still. He always would. But his heart no longer lived buried beneath them. Outside, winter finally surrendered to spring across the cliffs surrounding Blackthorne Hall. And inside the manor, two wounded souls who had once stood separated by silence now moved together beneath candlelight, as though destiny itself had quietly led them back to life. Because sometimes hearts do not heal when time passes. Sometimes they heal when someone finally teaches them they are still worthy of being loved.